Peter runs the Green Futures Networks for the University of Exeter, which are working to increase access to the latest climate and environmental research. He is also a climate coach, and he's a co-chair of the International Transition Network as well. So thank you so much, Peter, for joining us today. And Dom, if you just want to spotlight Peter and you can introduce us to what you're going to talk about.
No,
I couldn't hear you there for a moment.
First thing I want to do just before I start is a little very simple request, which we'll do, and then I'll come back to you later. So very simple. As soon as I put my hand up in the screen, you can see it. My ask is you put your hand up as well. So I'll put my hand up, you see it, you put your hand up. Simple as that. Great, thank you. Right, come back to that. So my name's Peter. I run the Green Futures Network, as Richard so kindly introduced, and part of my role is taking the latest climate research that we're doing at the University of Exeter and trying to get it out of the university and into the real world, where it can have impacts on governments, businesses, communities, all sorts of organizations and individuals. So this is one particular example around positive tipping points that I think has huge application, and I'm going to talk you through that, what tipping points are, why they're useful, and what you can do with them. Very brief initial introduction to the concept represented by this image here of a system state, which is the blue ball moving from one side, basin A to basin B. So what we're effectively talking about is how does a system shift from one state to another state? And rather than viewing it as a linear journey from A to B, we're looking at it as a more complex process that I will hopefully unpack. And another helpful definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, which I'll just read out. A tipping point is the point at which a series of small changes or incidents becomes significant enough to cause a larger, more important change. So that's what we're talking about, this idea of cumulative effects, of build-ups of interventions that can lead to really transformative impacts. So why is this useful? We're very good as human beings at being in a little box. We do this in our work in all sorts of ways, and we tell ourselves that everything is nice and simple. If we do A, it will lead to B. Sometimes this is right, but sometimes what happens is we're reminded, we open the door and we realize, oh, actually the world isn't quite that simple, and there's a lot more that's going on. And it can be really, really easy to not open that door, but once we do, it's very hard to close it again. And this is really important for various reasons, but three of which I wanted to illuminate. One is that when we oversimplify things, it can very easily lead to unintended consequences. If we don't really understand the system that we're operating in, we can't really understand all of the implications of that and what will happen as a result. Another thing is, it's really easy to be overwhelmed. I mean, this cartoon in and of itself is designed to be quite overwhelming. There's a lot going on. We can't take it all in. That can lead to paralysis. It can lead to anxiety and fear and dissonance. It can be a very difficult feeling. And the third thing is, it's really inefficient. If we don't think about the reality of what's going on and the systems that we're a part of, we can't really have as much impact as we might otherwise, if we really tune in to what is going on around us and the kind of impact we're trying to have. So I'm really excited about this framework as a way to try and overcome some of those and work towards a much more impactful and resonant way of acting in the world, particularly within the climate and ecological crises. So tipping points. Tipping points may well be a phrase you are familiar with, and traditionally, or what we're most familiar with them is in these contexts, which are A, ecological, so they're about how the natural world changes around us, and B, they tend to be negative. So here we've got deforestation, we've got glacial melt, we've got weather or monsoon seasons, and we're getting much, much better at understanding when these systems are reaching tipping points. So that's the point at which the system hasn't completely shifted yet, but we're past that point of all of those small little changes meaning that even though that big change isn't here yet, it's almost unavoidable. We've reached that tipping point. However, even though this is an incredibly important part of applying this concept, tipping points don't have to be just ecological, and they don't have to be just negative. So how can we look at these in a different way and think about, well, how do we take advantage of these in terms of positive tipping points? Tipping points actually work towards the kind of future that we want to see, not just in terms of ecology, but also technology and social change. So here's an example of how change happens from a technological perspective. What this graph is showing you is the uptake of particular technologies in American households over about 160 years. I'm sure it'd be very similar to many Western societies, not just America, but each of these lines represents a particular technology that has been implemented. So we've got running water, electric power, microwaves, smartphones, and you can see the vast majority of them, that line is incredibly steep. And the steeper the line, the quicker that technology has been taken up. And so this is showing us how quickly change can really happen. Like almost overnight, we can go from not having smartphones to suddenly they're everywhere. And the majority of people in a particular society can't imagine life without them. And this is really useful because it tells us that change can happen almost overnight, but also it makes us think about, well, what was going on before then? What about the technologies that aren't on here, things that didn't catch on? What is it about these technologies that meant that this rapid increase was really successful? And to think about that, it's useful then to think about, well, how does change happen more generally? How do we often think about change? And when we're thinking about a new system or a new thing happening, what we tend to do is we focus at the very end of this, what's called an S-curve, which is a way of looking at how things grow over time. And so we can look at that endpoint and think, right, well, what does it look like when this thing has been achieved, when we've got where we want to be? What does that point look like? And it's really difficult because we don't have control over it. We don't, there's so many variables. It's very hard to pinpoint that. And again, it's easy to get overwhelmed. So what it's more useful to look at is this point here. So this is the point on a kind of the growth curve where momentum really starts to build up. So you can see, well, we're nowhere near the end point. We're nowhere near that complete uptake of whatever this thing is. But this feels like a really significant moment. And again, if we just skip back to this slide, you can see that most of these lines start around that point. And they're not really telling us what happened before that. What was it about the social conditions, the technological conditions, the cultural conditions that meant that these things really took off once they had been designed and manufactured and advertised? Because really, that's where the key part of the story is. So coming back here, it's what's happening before that moment. It is something that we can look at much more tangibly than looking at the end of the curve, which is much more abstract. So for example, we could think about particular campaigns like peat-free compost. It's not necessarily that easy to look at, well, what does the end of that curve look like? Does it look like there's absolutely no peat-free compost being sold anywhere? Maybe it does. But maybe it's easier to look at, well, what would a more momentum towards that look like? It being banned in significant garden centres, for example. And maybe we could argue some of that's already happened. Similarly with plant-based diets. Even on this call, there's probably disagreement between each of us about what the end of that goal looks like. Does it look like everybody eating plant-based diets all the time? Or maybe half the people eating it 80% of the time? It's very unclear, but again, we can look at, well, momentum is certainly starting to shift. There's so much more available than there was 5-10 years ago. So maybe we're past that point and momentum is really ramping up. We can also look at it in terms of much more bigger systemic things like getting to net zero. We don't really know what that looks like, but we can see the momentum working towards it, or developing regenerative planning systems similarly. So it's really useful to step back a little bit from that overwhelming, complex endpoint and start looking at, well, where's that point where that momentum builds up? Because that is the tipping point that we can look at. And a helpful frame when talking about this is slightly shifting our understanding of impact. When we think about impact, whether we're an individual or a business or anything like that, we often think of these sort of very sudden, dramatic moments. Whereas actually, impact in terms of systems change often looks a lot more like this. It's about the cultivation. It's about these things happening slowly over time. Sometimes slowly, you can't even notice them, but it is happening, and it is often much, much more powerful. So coming back to this idea, and I'm going to unpack this in a little bit more detail and give some examples of what this looks like in practice. So this is our tipping point model. And so an easy way to think about this is this first side is about resistance. So in order to change the state of this system from basin A to basin B, we are facing a lot of resistance. There's a lot of things that want this to not happen, whether consciously or unconsciously, and we're pushing this up a hill, and you can feel the effort that goes into that. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. But once we've reached that tipping point, that resistance flips into momentum. So there's resistance and there's momentum on both sides, but that tipping point can be thought of as that point at which the dominant force changes from resistance to momentum. And so it's not in basin B yet once it's reached that tipping point, but momentum is carrying it towards it. And this is important because this highlights why it's key not to just look at that moment of the tipping point, but look at what's gone before it. So here are a couple of examples of things which could have been tipping points for us in the UK, where I'm based, looking at relatively recently, in the last couple of years, we've had extreme flooding and we've had extreme drought in the same year. And that is not uncommon around the world. In fact, in the UK, it's much less severe than it is in many places. And you could be forgiven for thinking, well, surely those are going to be tipping points. People experience such huge change and turmoil. That's surely going to lead us to a new state, a new system state. But actually what we can see that, yes, we can go that way, but also we can fall back down the hill. If for whatever reason that tipping point doesn't happen, we can go right back to where we started. And in a lot of ways, that's what we've seen in terms of policy, in terms of behavior, is we have these moments that could lead us into a new system, but for some reason they don't, and we end up back in business as usual, or something that looks very similar to it. So it's really important to understand what is actually going on here, and how do we unpick and model this a bit so we can be better at looking at what is it that causes systemic transformative change, because that is unquestionably what we need. And so we can start to think about it as, okay, well, what about this model would make that more likely? And I want to conceptualize it in terms of, let's think about gravity as a force here. If we push up that left-hand side, that basin A, it's going to make things easier. It's going to reduce that resistance. So unpacking that a little bit, we can look at the tipping points framework in basically 3 different sections. So this first one is we create the conditions for change. So nothing is going to happen unless those conditions are in place. So we could look at that as, yeah, within society, are those conditions in place? And if they are, then we have to reinforce them. So what are reinforcing feedbacks that are supporting that? So again, thinking about gravity as a force here, which is just an example, we're starting to push up that left-hand side of this model. And you can already start to see that's going to be reducing the resistance to the change. It's going to be shifting that model so that momentum is becoming more and more likely. So it's not quite there yet, but we're reinforcing those conditions. We're making that new system state much more likely. And then what happens is there's a point, and this is called the trigger, which is where suddenly that force goes up so far that gravity can take over, or whatever else it is, that force can take over, and the system goes into the new state. So creating the conditions for change, finding the reinforcing feedbacks, and then triggering the change. These are the 3 parts of the system. And just to unpack that a little bit more, I'll give some examples of what these different steps can involve. So, for example, creating the conditions for change, these are not exhaustive, but these are, I think, illustrative, and I'll give some practical examples of these in particular stories in a minute. But there are things in here around affordability, quality, desirability. Is this new system state something that feels good to people? Does it feel like something they can actually do? Does it feel like it's exciting, it's better than the alternative? Does it make sense? And then within feedback loops, many of these are quite intuitive. Critical mass, most of us are familiar with this idea that if you get a large enough group of a population, then something can take root very, very quickly. Economies of scale is the idea that the more we do something, the cheaper it gets. Learning by doing, the more we do something, the better at it we get. So there are these feedback loops that can really reinforce these conditions. And then coordination, social networks, these idea that all of these people working together on a similar thing, if we can collaborate and come together, will have a much bigger impact than we will individually. So again, we can reinforce each other. And then once those things are ready, that trigger can look like lots of different things. It can be an innovation, like a new invention, a new policy that comes in, some behavior change that ripples through the population, investment, which could be money, could be something else, or new information that comes to light. So if all of those other things are in place, that trigger can be the thing that just tips that state, that system over the edge into that new system state or towards it. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second and give an example, which is what we did at the very start of holding our hands up. So it's unsurprising that no one has still got their hand up, even though I didn't say put your hand down. But it's a good example of how the system that we were looking at there in terms of moving from a state where none of us had our hands up to all of us had our hands up, changed very, very easily and very quickly, but didn't stay in that way. We all put our hands down eventually, and there are some very good reasons for that. But I think it's a helpful example to start getting into this idea. So the conditions for that change were that my instructions were quite clear and simple. Just as soon as I put my hand up, put your hand up. It felt accessible to I assume most people. Putting your hand up is not accessible to everybody, but for the majority of people, it's something that's fairly simple to do. We were in this environment where I have an element of authority and I can ask you to do things. And then there are feedback loops. You know, maybe you weren't the first person to put your hand up, but you saw someone else do it, and so you did it as well. There's that social contagion. But there are also dampening feedback loops as well, which is one of the reasons why we don't still have our hands up. So there's a social aspect to that of maybe we see other people put their hands down. There's also a physical aspect of we keep our hands up for too long, lactic acid builds up, it becomes quite painful and uncomfortable, so we put our hands down again. So the reason I share this fairly simple and trivial example, I think it's a good example of how it's really, really hard to change the state of a system. And there are so many reasons why it doesn't happen very often. There are so many reasons and forces that keep things as they are, that keep the status quo in place. So even if a change happens, if all of the other things weren't in place and weren't what they needed to be, that system can just revert to where it was. So we go from not putting our hands up to putting our hands up, but then that system is not permanent and we come back to where we are. So again, a fairly simple example, but I think it's helpful to then get into, well, what does that mean in practice in more important systems? So with that in mind, coming back to this, and I've got a few more examples, and then I'll finish up. So I've already talked about how in this model, the system can move to a new state, or it can roll back, but there are also other things that can happen. And so I want to invite you to look at this image not in a two-dimensional way, but in a three-dimensional way. So imagine you're pushing a ball up to the top of a hill, and you get to the top of the hill and you let go of that ball. You know that that ball is going to roll down that hill, but you don't necessarily know exactly where it's going to end up, because there's almost an infinite number of permutations as to where that ball could end. You know that change is coming, but you can't necessarily predict exactly where it's going to be. So it could end up in A, in B, or it could end up in these other example basins of C, D, and E. And it's really important to think about these and think about, well, what are those potential alternative new states? Are those desirable, or are those maybe undesirable? So one example that I find particularly compelling is thinking about political change. We can often think that, well, change is going to come maybe through an election or something else, but if things do change, are they necessarily going to change for the better? In the UK and many other places around the world, I think we can see change could be positive, but there are potential new states like increased fascism, which are ready to take the place of the current system if the conditions were right for it. So we have to be careful about not pushing for change's sake, and really think about what kind of change do we want, which makes this part of the system really, really important. These are what are called early warning indicators. When we're in this stage of the system, we start to notice that the current regime or current system is losing power, is losing stability. We don't necessarily know where it's going to lead to, but we can tell that something is going to change. That resistance to change is reduced a lot. So it's really, whether we're talking about putting our hands up, peat-free compost, or fascism, this model still operates, and it's really, really useful to think about what is actually going on. So some examples. These are some, I can share these resources, they're available online. I ran a series of webinars, workshops online last year looking at how we can apply this model in different contexts, and getting some examples in different systems. So just an example, one of the workshops I did was around social movements. So we were looking at, okay, so that is a system. What are some of the conditions for change that might lead to transformation? And so a couple of examples here. Are we creating inclusive and diverse spaces? Are we building relationships locally? Those are the kind of things that make change more likely. And then what are the reinforcing feedback loops? Okay, so are there ways for information to flow between communities? If they are, then those things can reinforce each other. Is there support for resilience and well-being that keeps us sustained? That means we don't just burn out and drop out. That reinforces us as well and keeps us in the game. And then what might those triggers be? So something like COVID, a pandemic, is an example of something that if the conditions are right, can lead to very quick change. Another thing, again, an example certainly seen in the UK, is David Attenborough's Blue Planet 2 program, which seemingly led to a complete transformation in terms of how people saw marine plastics overnight. And suddenly it became a huge campaign, plastic-free cities and towns, banning straws, all sorts of single-use plastic. But that thing didn't happen overnight. There was already a lot of work being done in that space that was often invisible. But there was something about that as a trigger that really got a lot of the general public on board, that made it much more easy for all of those campaigning groups to have an impact. So an even more practical example that, again, I find really, really useful is looking at mutual aid. So mutual aid is within communities, effectively people looking after each other, but in an organized way. How do we support ourselves within our community? Within COVID, again, we saw a lot of it in terms of people picking up medicine for each other, people taking each other to hospital appointments, or picking up groceries for the more vulnerable people in their communities. And this is not a new idea. This has been around for many, many years. But during the pandemic, around the world, we saw a real increase in the rise of mutual aid groups. And so it's useful to think about, okay, well, why did that happen? What was it about what was in place that allowed that system to shift from being a relatively small thing to being much, much bigger and much more widespread? And so some of the conditions include things like local knowledge. Okay, so within a community, people often already know who is vulnerable, who has access to a car, where is the best place to get groceries, what time is the health centre open. That knowledge already exists. Without it, this wouldn't work. Communication channels. Often communities might have a WhatsApp group or a Facebook group or something like that, a place that has already been built up that people can come to at the moment of an emergency. Sometimes there are clear roles and processes. Maybe someone is the driver, or someone's the facilitator, or the convener, or the organizer, or someone is someone who knows who is it that needs support in this particular moment. And those roles and processes have already informally been created, so it's very easy to formalize them when needed. And legitimacy. There's already trust built up in a community. And if someone came in from the outside and tried to start a mutual aid group, maybe we wouldn't get the same response because they don't have that same cultural legitimacy. So anything that happened before this moment that contributed to those ideas was creating the conditions for change for mutual aid groups to really increase. And it's important as well to note that's not the end of the story. This is a quotation. I'll just read this out. Mutual aid offered by group-based models and social movement networks provides routes to community resilience that support community-led responses to climate change focused on collective advocacy and care. So what that is saying is mutual aid itself, as well as being a potential new system that's been triggered by a tipping point, could also be contributing to a new tipping point. It's also contributing to the increase in community-led responses to climate change. So these things don't happen in isolation, and these cascades all influence each other. One more example before I finish up, which is quite a different one, moving from social change to technological change. This graph on the left, it's a little bit out of date now, but it gives the idea. This is the proportion of new cars being registered in these countries that are electric. And you can see Norway is far and away ahead at 64.5%, Germany, the next one at 13.6%. And this is a huge difference. And so it begs the question of, okay, well, what is it that's going on about electric vehicles in Norway? And there's various things. So initially, the price goes down as more and more cars get produced, get created, so it becomes cheaper, more affordable. As we get better at making these things, the quality goes up. So again, it's a more desirable thing to happen. You see more people driving cars that are electric, you're more likely to do it. It feels like a thing that is socially accepted. It becomes more accessible. There's more information about it. People know where to go. There's maybe a dealership nearby, something like that. But also the power infrastructure in Norway, if there's more investment into that, then it's more likely people will purchase electric vehicles because they can trust that they'll be able to use them getting around where they need to go. And at the same time, one of the things that's really different, or was really different in Norway, was that there was more taxation on vehicles that were not electric. So it's the cost of the alternative going up. Because all of those first four things could have been the same in those other countries, although there's differing degrees as to whether that's the case. But then the cost of the alternative going up is something that adds a new dimension to that. It's even more motivation to change behavior, to shift that system, but from having a petrol or diesel car to having an electric car. So this is, I think, maybe an easier example to look at. With technology, you can measure these things, but also it's an important one because this brings into question of what is a positive and negative tipping point. Is having a lot of electric vehicles, is that positive? Is that contributing to the modal shift we need towards more active travel, or is it just creating more resources that are being used and more traffic on the roads? And so there's a lot of subjectivity and nuance in here. But another thing, and this is quite an overwhelming image and really don't feel like you have to take it all in, I'll talk through what's useful about this, is another thing that we talk about in terms of, well, is it a positive tipping point? What this graphic is showing you is tipping cascades between different systems. So in the sort of top middle, we've got electric vehicles, light duty roads, so that's kind of general cars. And we can see as that increases, there are reinforcing feedbacks to all of these other systems due to particular conditions like battery prices get better, operation costs get better. So that's leading to a reinforcing feedback for solar, wind and power and storage, which is a reinforcing feedback onto green ammonia fertilizers and shipping. So these things are all interconnected. So we can look at them in terms of, is this thing in isolation positive or negative, but also what are the positive and potentially negative cascades from that. My very last slide before getting to questions is then looking at all of these things are feeding off each other. So all of these tipping points where the positive or negative don't just stop, they lead on and they impact each other. And this is a cycle that goes round and round. This is a graphic taken from a community of practice on tipping points that I'm running with a small group of people, where we're trying to collectively create a resource that can be used by anyone to try and map this and build it into their planning and their strategy and use that model in any way they want to. And this is one of the key messages, is that even if there is a tipping point, the world doesn't stop there and these things continue. So it's a really helpful way of trying to conceptualize that complexity that I talked about at the beginning. So I've spoken for a long time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there, and I'd love to hear any questions or reflections on that. I could talk about it all day, but it's great to get completely different reflections and perspectives into the conversation. So Richard, back to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Peter. Really, really fascinating, and lots of thoughts popping into my head, and a few questions too. But I don't want to ask mine until everyone else has had a chance to ask theirs. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask Peter, if you just want to raise a hand, and I go to you. Isaac, do you want to go for it?
Hi, thanks, Richard, and thank you, Peter. A fantastic and fascinating lecture. I really enjoyed it. I had a question about I guess some larger tipping points that perhaps would affect multiple tipping points. You know how you say it's all interlinked. I think there's a few biggies around like AI, which I think I'd love to hear your thought on that. Because AI, especially when I start thinking about it, is that a lot of the things that could come out of AI isn't necessarily good, could be also bad. And I feel like it's one of those things that could allow multiple things to tip at the same time. It's like a multiple cascade, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, because it's quite fascinating during these times where we're starting to release a lot more AI into the world.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and I won't pretend to be an expert on AI, but I think it's a great example of something that we talk about AI as though it's one thing, and I know that's not what you're suggesting, but in the wider sphere, it's this single idea that's obviously actually lots of different things that are going on, that doesn't necessarily have a positive or negative bias inherently. But it's really interesting to think, well, how will that change things? And are we seeing a shift towards a greater uptake in AI? And I think one of the things about the framework that I find particularly useful is it can help us break that question down a little bit into what is it actually that we are asking. And so in the system that you or I or anyone particularly is specifically working in, what is the implication of AI? Is it a trigger to some conditions that have already been put in place? And I think you could look at it in that way, in terms of there are some ways in which AI is going to reinforce some negative situations that we're already in, and it's going to reinforce the status quo and allow powerful systems to maintain their power. But then we could also look at it in other ways, in terms of access to healthcare, or some aspects of creativity where it maybe open things up and has the opportunity to really change a system. And so that's, I think, the interesting point for me, is looking at which of those things is happening in which moment. And there isn't a right answer, obviously, because it's more complex than that. But really then to try to think, well, that helps me then locate myself in relation to what is a huge and incredibly complex challenge. So it's a very big question, and requires a lot more time to really get into. But I think it's a really great example of, this doesn't solve that. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a way of looking at that in a way that's a lot more nuanced than some of the conversations about AI and the way that we're talking about it that I'm seeing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Has anyone else got a question they want to? Osbert, do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Peter. So I've done a lot of work around that sort of system change stuff, and use a slightly different model. I'm more familiar with the 3 horizons approach. That's why I tend to start things. But one of the things that I was really interested in is to that's a long and really quite complicated and sophisticated model you're explaining there. I guess one of the challenges we see, not so much for sort of people who are working on policy or trying to design projects, but the people they're working with in the communities or wherever, is this sense of there's not much point in me doing anything because nothing will ever change. And I think there's something around what effective ways have you found to really sort of, talk about that system change stuff, those tipping points, in a way which people can grasp really quickly and think, yeah, actually, me getting involved in eating less meat or whatever, and also perhaps the sort of the shifting that individual stuff into collective action, getting my family doing it, getting my friends talking about this at work. So breaking down this, either I should do something, but there's not much point because it's only me, or we've got to wait for the system to change. And unless you're a policymaker or a campaigner, it feels like, well, you're sort of stuck. And there's not much comms around that, in my experience. Any reflections on that rather rambling question, observation?
No, definitely. I love that, and that resonates a lot with me. There's a couple of things in there for me. I have talked about this a lot with community groups and community networks, and the really dominant response is that it really gives people hope, motivation, and inspiration, because it is about this idea that in those worlds we get so trained or conditioned to think about impact in terms of what we can measure, how we get funding, how many people turned up this event, how many people are doing that thing, what's the direct carbon saving of that, and what it can be really quite reductive to do that, and to feel quite powerless. What can I do in the face of all of this stuff? Whereas what this is trying to do is acknowledge that yes, that stuff is important, but also thinking about the mutual aid example, everything you do as an individual, as part of a community group or on your own, that is creating the conditions for other change that you cannot control and you are not responsible for, but is coming, because we can see that momentum starting to shift. Everything you do that is cultivating those conditions is positive and is helping that. But also some of the stuff you do is going to be negative, because in a complex system, everything we do has a negative implication somewhere. And this is, I think, an invitation to, acknowledge that and not get so lost in the idea that everything we do has to be perfect and we have to wait until we have the perfect thing. So yes, I absolutely agree. And I think it helps that balance between everything individual is important because nothing is individual, because everything is part of that kind of collective system. Even if no one else knows about it, it's still cultivating that change. And my mum is in this moment at the moment. She's never been that interested in, well, not interested, aware of climate change, but I've seen the last month something has switched for her, and she's constantly asking me, what's the best thing that I can do? And my response to her is, there isn't a thing, but it's, think about the conditions that you want to change and what you can do within that, and don't get fixated on the direct impact or consequence of those things that you see, because it's not going to feel like a lot at the moment. But find solace in the fact that there are a lot of other people doing it. So if you get tired, if you get burnt out, if you get stressed and you have to step back, the more we know that we're part of that wider system of conditions being changed, it doesn't fall to us as an individual. So I think it kind of, for me, it bursts that bubble of, is it individual, is it collective? It's sort of, that's not the right question for me.
Thanks.
Andy, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Peter, thank you for that. I was quite enjoyed that a lot. And I guess the question I had as you were going through that, I talk about S-shaped curves quite a lot in business, and all businesses just want to play on one part of that curve, which is really frustrating. And I guess the key around why they don't want to play on the bottom left-hand side is because it's really hard to create metrics by which they can start to measure change in an early space, and trying to get them to see what they're doing in a bigger picture can be tricky, as I'm sure you're aware. What metrics? It's a difficult question, I guess. How do you find framing the metrics around that change in the bottom left-hand corner effective, so that actually you can get people to realise that a small amount of change is leading to something much bigger longer term?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, great question. That's exactly what is being researched right now at the moment at the University of Exeter. So that example I showed towards the end of the sort of cascade effects from electric vehicles, things, there is work going on into how do we measure that? in different systems, in technological systems. Social systems is a lot harder, and I think that'll take a bit more time. But there's a report due to come out, I think, next month, that will unpack this in a bit more detail, and I can make sure Richard gets that and is able to share that around for anyone who's interested. But yeah, that's one of the main challenges, is that we are so used to metrics that are looking at that end point and are quite linear. It's going to take a while and a shift. And, you know, we're again thinking about it in terms of tipping points. We're already seeing momentum, a lot more organizations recognizing the current paradigms don't work, shifting to things like donor economics and other models, that if we can then create some metrics that are imperfect but useful, and probably just as imperfect as the things we already use, that's going to then help that shift towards more and more organizations seeing themselves further down that S-curve, as you say. So watch this space, I guess, is my short answer.
Thank you.
Ian, you want to go ahead? Oh.
There goes, unmute myself. There we go. I do, but before I do that, I actually want to offer a thought on the previous question. And I wonder whether, to some extent, Peter started to answer your question, Andy, which is maybe we should be measuring are we seeing the conditions of change being put in place, or are we measure actually how well we're putting in conditions that might generate change? And maybe that's the thing to measure at the early stage. Not worry about what the outcome measure is. Actually start measuring inputs that might help you generate the conditions for change. So that's the thought that occurred to me as you were asking that question. So my question, Peter, that was a fascinating framework, and I've not seen that before, but it made me realize that I've spent much of the last 7 or 8 years of my life working on creating those conditions for change, specifically with SMEs. So I've spent my time helping SMEs to get to grips with understanding their impact on climate change and trying to mitigate their impact on climate change. And I hadn't really framed it in those frameworks, but I realized now when I looked at your tick list of things, oh yeah, I've been working on a lot of those things, which is really helpful. And I can see how I might start to think more about working on creating more feedback loops, because I think that's an area where I could do some more useful work now. The one that I'm finding more challenging is the triggers. Have you got any tips for how we can either identify or help to make happen those trigger conditions?
Yeah, that's probably the hardest point, because often those triggers are out of our control directly. If we're talking about policy or a new invention or something like that. So I think what we can do is work towards them and understand, well, how do those things happen? Pushing more towards that idea of the current system losing its stability than necessarily the thing itself, because systems are automatically self-regulating, and they tend towards chaos, but then they don't stay in chaos for very long. And so if what you're doing is kind of pushing towards change, a trigger will emerge in some form. So if it's big, it is very difficult, and maybe we can look at it on a case-by-case basis. For smaller ones, so for example, I think this model is quite useful for thinking about individual personal change through things like coaching, and in a workplace, for example, I want things to be a different way. I don't have total control over that. How do I create those conditions? And in a system like that, it's much easier to think about what that trigger might be. Maybe it's the CEO saying something, or something happening at a particular team meeting or something like that. So it's really understanding what is the system I'm operating in, and what are those moments where change does happen, and how do I build towards one of those? And it's going to be different in every context.
That's made me even more excited using it in that context. I hadn't thought of that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. I found it really uplifting, actually, hearing a discussion around not just we need systemic change, but here is a framework that potentially assists us in heading towards systemic change. You know, the evolution of these conversations over the course of just a year or so within this forum, but you know, many other forums as well. I think there is more and more to be excited about, and that points towards the idea that these tipping points are happening left, right, and centre without us necessarily being aware of them.